Daniel had expected the old house to smell like dust, damp wood, and the kind of memories nobody wanted anymore. He had not expected to find 47 sealed letters hidden inside a wall. Every envelope had been addressed to the same man, Walter, and every envelope carried the same sender's name, Eleanor. But there was something even stranger. Not one of them had ever been opened. For decades, those letters had remained hidden only a few feet from the dining table where Walter had spent most of his life. Daniel stood over them, unsure whether he should touch anything. Then Sarah picked up the final envelope. She stared at it for several seconds. "Daniel?" He looked at her. Sarah slowly turned the envelope toward him. The other 46 letters had Walter's name written across the front, but this one did not. It said, "For Daniel only." Daniel felt his stomach tighten. The envelope had been sealed more than 20 years earlier, and the woman who had written it was someone Walter had spent Daniel's entire life pretending did not matter. Before Daniel opened that final letter, he would discover something far more disturbing. The house Walter had left him did not simply contain old furniture and forgotten photographs. It contained a version of Daniel's own life he had never been allowed to know. Walter had died several weeks earlier, and in his will, he had left the old family house to Daniel. At first, Daniel had no intention of keeping it. The place needed work. The wallpaper was peeling. The pipes groaned whenever the water ran. Several rooms looked as though nobody had touched them in decades. Daniel believed the easiest thing would be to clean everything out, sell the house, and move on. Sarah wasn't so sure. She convinced him not to make the decision too quickly. Walter had lived there for most of his adult life. Daniel himself had spent much of his childhood inside those rooms. Even if he eventually sold it, Sarah thought he should at least look through everything first. Daniel agreed. But the truth was, being inside the house made him uncomfortable. Every room reminded him of Walter. Walter had never been an easy man to understand. He rarely said what he felt. He did not apologize easily. He did not talk about the past. And whenever Daniel asked a question Walter did not want to answer, Walter had a way of looking at him that ended the conversation before it really began. There was one subject Daniel had learned never to bring up: Eleanor. When Daniel was younger, he had asked Walter about her many times. Walter's answers were always short. Eleanor left. She made her decision. She did not want the life they had. And eventually, Daniel stopped asking. For years he believed Eleanor had simply walked away. But Sarah had always noticed something strange. Whenever Eleanor's name came up, Walter did not sound like a man who had forgotten someone. He sounded like a man trying very hard to remember her in only one particular way. A few days after Daniel inherited the house, Sarah found an old photograph in the back of a drawer. Walter was much younger. Beside him stood Eleanor. Daniel had seen pictures of Walter from those years before, but this photograph was different. Walter was smiling. Not the small, controlled smile Daniel remembered. A real smile. Eleanor was leaning toward him. They looked happy. On the back of the photograph someone had written a sentence in faded ink. "The house is only a house until someone waits for you inside it." Daniel knew immediately the handwriting belonged to Eleanor. At the words longer than he expected, Walter had always described their relationship as though Eleanor had never valued the home they built. Yet that sentence did not sound like it had come from someone who wanted to disappear. Sarah asked Daniel when Eleanor had left. Daniel opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. He knew the story, but suddenly he realized he did not know the details. He did not know the exact year. He did not know what caused the argument. He did not know whether Eleanor had tried to return. All Daniel really knew was Walter's conclusion. Eleanor left. That was it. Daniel put the photograph aside and continued cleaning. Several days later, he began removing an old cabinet attached to the dining room wall. One of the screws had rusted badly. Daniel pulled harder. The wood shifted. A section of old plaster cracked. Something moved behind the wall. Daniel froze. There was a soft sliding sound. Sarah looked up. What was that? Daniel knocked against the wall. Something was definitely inside. At first, they assumed it was old newspaper or insulation. Daniel removed another piece of plaster. A yellow envelope dropped onto the floor. Then another. Then 3 more. Daniel and Sarah looked at each other. Behind the wall was a narrow compartment. Someone had deliberately built it there. Daniel reached inside and pulled out a bundle wrapped carefully in old cloth. He carried it to Walter's dining table. Sarah slowly removed the cloth. Inside were letters, dozens of them. Daniel counted. 47. Every envelope was sealed. Sarah began checking the dates. Then weeks. Then months. Eventually, years separated them. The handwriting changed too. The earliest envelopes were neat and confident. Later ones looked less steady. But one thing never changed. The sender. Eleanor. Daniel felt something shift inside him. Walter had told him Eleanor left and never looked back. But someone who never looked back did not write 47 letters. Sarah picked up one envelope. Why didn't Walter open them? Daniel said perhaps he did not want to hear from her. Sarah looked at the bundle. Then why keep them? Daniel had no answer. Walter could have thrown them away. He could have burned them. He could have returned them. Instead, he had preserved every one of them, then hidden them inside the wall. Daniel said they should put everything back. The letters were private. Walter was dead. Eleanor might be dead too. Whatever happened between them belonged to the past. Sarah did not argue. She began gathering the envelopes. Then she stopped. Daniel. There was something about the last one. Sarah picked it up. It was different. Instead of Walter's name, Daniel's name was written across the front. Daniel took it from her. His fingers tightened around it. The envelope was still sealed. The date meant Daniel had still been young when Eleanor wrote it. For more than 20 years, Walter had kept a letter addressed directly to Daniel, hidden inside his wall. Daniel began tearing it open. Sarah stopped him. Wait. Daniel looked at her. If that is the last letter, maybe we need to know what happened before. Daniel stared at the other 46 envelopes. He did not want to read them. But now he needed to know why his own name was there. He picked up the first letter. The seal broke with almost no resistance. The paper inside had yellowed with age. Daniel began reading. The first sentence immediately challenged everything Walter had ever told him. Walter, I know you're angry, but please don't turn one terrible night into the rest of our lives. Daniel stopped. Sarah said nothing. He continued. Eleanor admitted she had left the house during an argument. But she said she had never intended to leave permanently. She thought Walter needed time. She thought she needed time. She expected to return. According to the letter, she had already tried calling. Walter refused to answer. She had come back to the house. Walter would not speak to her. Daniel lowered the letter. Walter had never told him any of this. The second letter was worse. Eleanor wrote, If you hate me, tell me. If you forgive me, tell me. Just don't make silence your answer. Daniel felt defensive. These are her words. That doesn't mean they're true. Sarah nodded. That is true. But then she asked one simple question. If Walter thought she was lying, why didn't he open any of them? Daniel looked down. He had no answer. They opened the third letter, and this time, Eleanor mentioned Daniel. She asked whether Daniel still left the hallway light on at night. Daniel's face changed. He had. As a child, he had been afraid of sleeping in complete darkness. Eleanor mentioned the chair Daniel always sat in, the breakfast he refused to eat, a small habit he had when he became nervous. Details Walter had never told him, Eleanor knew. Daniel suddenly realized something. Eleanor had not been a distant person from Walter's past. She had known Daniel. She had been part of his life. And somehow, Daniel had forgotten almost all of it. He closed the letter. Walter raised me. Sarah looked at him. I know. He stayed. I know. She didn't. Sarah waited. Daniel's voice became harder. Whatever happened, Walter was there. Sarah nodded. But staying doesn't automatically make every decision he made right. Daniel stood up. You didn't know him like I did. Sarah looked directly at him. You're right. Then she said something Daniel would remember for the rest of the night. But maybe you didn't know him the way you thought either. Daniel left the dining room. Hours later, he came back. The envelopes were still spread across the table. Walter's chair was empty. For the first time since Walter died, Daniel felt angry with him. Not because he knew Walter had lied. Not yet. But because Daniel was beginning to understand that Walter might have controlled what Daniel was allowed to know. Sarah sat beside him. Daniel admitted he was afraid to continue. If Eleanor was telling the truth, he would have to rethink much of his childhood. If Eleanor was lying, then the last hope of understanding her would disappear. Sarah told him not to decide who was right yet. Just find out what happened. So Daniel kept reading. Letter 7 said Eleanor had returned to the house one afternoon. Walter would not open the door. Letter 9 said she waited outside until dark. Letter 11 said she had seen Daniel through an upstairs window. Daniel stopped. A memory returned. Rain against the glass, a figure standing near the gate. Daniel had remembered that image for years, but never knew whether it was real. Now he wondered if the person outside had been Eleanor. The 14th letter contained one sentence that changed everything. Whatever happens between us, Daniel should not be punished for our pride. Daniel read it again. Our pride. Eleanor was not pretending to be innocent. She admitted leaving. She admitted saying things she regretted. She admitted waiting too long before trying to repair the damage. But one thing was becoming impossible to deny. She had tried to come back, again and again, and Walter had answered with silence. Daniel looked at the remaining envelopes. Every one represented a moment Walter could have chosen differently. Then Daniel noticed the dates near the end. The letters became less frequent. Eleanor was giving up. Letter 37 came long after 36. 40 came later still. By 45, years had passed. Then Daniel looked at the final two. Letter 46 was addressed to Walter. Letter 47 was addressed to Daniel. Sarah saw what he was thinking. If 47 was for you, Daniel picked up number 46. Then this might explain why she stopped writing to him. He opened it. Eleanor's handwriting was noticeably shakier. The letter did not begin with an apology. She did not ask Walter to forgive her. She did not ask him to come back. Instead, it began with a goodbye. Walter, this will be the last letter I ever send you. Daniel kept reading. Eleanor wrote that she finally understood Walter's silence was not temporary. It was a choice. She would stop trying to convince him. But before she disappeared completely, she asked Walter for one final thing. Give Daniel the next envelope. Let Daniel decide whether he wanted to know her. Daniel slowly looked toward letter 47. Walter had never given it to him. He had hidden it inside the wall. Sarah's voice was quiet. Daniel? Daniel looked at her. He didn't only refuse to answer Eleanor. Sarah glanced at the envelope bearing Daniel's name. He made sure you couldn't answer her either. Daniel reached for the 47th letter. And for the first time in more than 20 years, someone was finally about to open it. Daniel held the 47th letter in both hands. For more than 20 years, it had been hidden inside Walter's wall. Only a few feet from the dining table, where Daniel had eaten breakfast, celebrated birthdays, argued, laughed, and eventually said goodbye to Walter. Walter had known the letter was there. Daniel had not. Sarah looked at him. "Do you want me to leave?" Daniel shook his head. No. He did not want to discover another version of his childhood alone. He broke the seal. The letter began with 2 words. "Dear Daniel." He stopped. Just seeing his name in Eleanor's handwriting felt strangely intimate. Then he continued, "If you're reading this, I hope it means Walter finally decided you deserved your own choice." Daniel lowered the paper. The sentence hurt immediately, because Walter had never made that choice. Eleanor wrote that Daniel might have been told she left because she no longer wanted them. She said that was not true. She admitted she had walked out of the house. She admitted she had hurt Walter. She admitted she had said things during their argument that she regretted. But she had never planned to disappear from Daniel's life. She believed the separation would last a few days. Days became weeks. Walter stopped answering. Eleanor tried to return. He refused to open the door. She tried again. Walter became even more determined. Then Eleanor wrote something Daniel had never expected. "I stopped coming to the house because I began to believe seeing me outside and being told not to come near me would hurt you more than my absence." Daniel stopped reading. For most of his life, he had believed Eleanor simply stopped caring. Walter had told him she chose another life. Now Eleanor was claiming she had disappeared because she believed continuing to fight Walter might hurt Daniel. Sarah watched his face. Daniel was trying to hold 2 versions of Walter in his mind. The man who had raised him, and the man who might have kept him away from someone who wanted him. Daniel kept reading. Eleanor finally explained the argument. Walter had always needed stability. He wanted the house controlled, predictable, safe. Eleanor felt that Walter's need for control eventually entered every part of their lives, especially Daniel's. She believed Daniel was becoming afraid of disappointing Walter. Walter believed Eleanor undermined him whenever she disagreed. That night, an argument that should have ended in an hour became something much larger. Both said things designed to hurt. Eleanor packed a small bag. Before leaving, she told Walter, "Maybe you'll understand what this house feels like when there's nobody left inside it." To Eleanor, it was an angry sentence. To Walter, it sounded like abandonment. When Eleanor returned days later, Walter would not let her in. She thought he needed more time. Walter thought he was protecting himself. Eleanor became more frustrated. Walter became more certain. Pride fed pride. Eventually, silence replaced the argument. Daniel put the letter down. He wanted to hate Walter in that moment, but the memories would not allow it. Walter had taught Daniel how to repair things. Walter had sat beside him when he was sick. Walter had waited awake when Daniel came home late. Walter remembered birthdays. He had saved money quietly for Daniel. He had loved Daniel. That was not fake. Sarah seemed to understand the conflict. 2 things can be true. Daniel looked at her. She continued, "Walter could love you, and Walter could make a terrible decision because he loved you." Daniel shook his head. "Love doesn't excuse it." No, Sarah did not argue. "It doesn't." Daniel looked at Eleanor's letter again. The final page contained an address. It was old, possibly useless. Daniel assumed Eleanor had moved long ago. Sarah checked the last several envelopes. They carried the same return address. What if she's still there? Daniel laughed nervously. After all these years? Maybe. Daniel immediately rejected the idea. What if Eleanor was dead? What if she was alive but did not want to see him? What if Walter's version contained something the letters did not? Sarah looked at the envelopes spread across the table. Daniel, she wrote 47 letters. He said nothing. Sarah continued. Whatever else happened, someone who writes 47 letters was not trying very hard to be forgotten. Daniel walked back to the wall. He examined the hidden compartment again. Sarah noticed the plaster around it had been repaired more than once. That meant something neither of them had considered. Walter might not have hidden all the letters at the same time. He may have reopened the wall repeatedly, added more envelopes, closed it again. Every time Eleanor wrote, Walter may have taken the new letter, carried it into the dining room, opened the wall, and placed it beside the others. Daniel imagined it. 1 letter, then 2, then 10, then 20, 47 chances. Sarah looked at the bundle. Maybe part of him wanted them found. Head. If he wanted me to find them, he could have just handed them to me, Sarah answered quietly. Unless admitting what he did was the one thing he never learned how to do. Daniel did not respond. Instead of reading the letters in order, he began choosing dates he recognized. One arrived close to a birthday. Eleanor wrote that she had bought Daniel a small gift, but did not know whether sending it would make things worse. Another arrived near a holiday. Eleanor wrote that she wondered whether Daniel still laughed when he tried not to. Another contained one sentence Daniel could barely read. I wonder if he remembers my voice. Daniel lowered the paper. He didn't. He could remember Walter's voice perfectly. Sarah's, his own childhood rooms, the sound of the stairs, the old dining table. But Eleanor's voice was gone. That realization broke something in him. He had not simply been kept away from Eleanor. Time had erased her from his memory. Daniel finally agreed to visit the address. During the drive, he repeatedly considered turning back. Sarah did not pressure him. After a long silence, Daniel spoke. I spent most of my life believing she didn't want me. Sarah listened. If she's alive and all of this is true, he paused. That means she did. Sarah looked at him. Daniel stared out the window. I think that's worse. Sarah understood why. If Eleanor had never cared, Daniel had lost nothing except an illusion. But if she had wanted him, then Daniel had lost years that might actually have existed. They reached the address. The house looked older than Daniel expected. Seconds. He remained inside the car. Sarah waited. Eventually, Daniel walked to the front door. He knocked. Nothing. He knocked again. Footsteps. The door opened. An elderly woman stood there. Daniel knew immediately. Eleanor. She looked very different from the photograph, but her eyes were the same. Daniel opened his mouth. No words came. Eleanor stared at him. Her expression changed slowly. Confusion, recognition, shock, and then something that looked almost like grief. Daniel? She had recognized him before he said his name. Daniel felt his throat tighten. Sarah stepped back slightly. Eleanor invited them inside. For several moments, nobody knew what to say. Daniel finally placed one of the envelopes on the table. Eleanor stared at it. Her face changed again. Where did you find those? Daniel answered. Inside Walter's wall. Eleanor closed her eyes. Daniel expected surprise, but Eleanor did not look surprised that Walter had never opened them. She looked surprised that he had kept them. Daniel asked the question he had been carrying since the first envelope. Was everything you wrote true? Eleanor looked directly at him. Everything I wrote was true as I understood it. Daniel waited. Then Eleanor added, but that doesn't mean Walter had no truth of his own. That answer caught Daniel off guard. Eleanor could have blamed Walter for everything. She did not. She explained that Walter feared abandonment deeply. When Eleanor walked out that night, she touched the exact fear he had spent years protecting. To her, she was leaving an argument. To Walter, she was leaving him. When she returned, Walter had already changed the meaning of what happened. He believed anyone who could leave once could leave again. Eleanor admitted she made things worse. She demanded forgiveness before understanding why Walter was hurt. She became angry when he would not speak. Walter became more stubborn when she pushed. Daniel listened, then asked the question Eleanor could not soften. Why didn't he let me decide? Eleanor looked down. I can't defend that. Daniel's eyes filled. That wasn't his decision. No, Eleanor's voice was quiet. It wasn't. Then Eleanor revealed something Daniel had never known. Years after the letter stopped, Walter came to see her. Daniel stared. What? He came here. Eleanor said Walter stood outside the door. He did not come inside. They talked only briefly. Walter asked whether Eleanor had remarried. She said no. Eleanor asked about Daniel. Walter said Daniel was doing well. Then Eleanor asked Walter the question she had waited years to ask. Did you ever read my letters? Daniel leaned forward. What did he say? Eleanor looked at him. He said no. Daniel's jaw tightened. Eleanor asked Walter why he had kept them. Walter answered, because throwing them away would mean I was certain. Daniel went completely still. Walter had never been certain. That was the truth hidden beneath the wall. He was not certain Eleanor was wrong. Certain he had made the right choice. He simply could not bring himself to open anything that might prove otherwise. Eleanor continued. Before Walter left, he asked her one final question. If Daniel ever comes looking for you, what will you tell him about me? Daniel stared at her. What did you say? Eleanor answered, I told him I would tell you the truth. Daniel waited. I would tell you he loved you. Her eyes became wet. And I would tell you that loving you didn't stop him from hurting you. Daniel looked away. For the first time, he felt as though he understood Walter and resented him at the same time. Eleanor stood and left the room briefly. When she returned, she carried an old photograph. It was another copy of the photograph Daniel and Sarah had found. Walter and Eleanor. Young, happy. Eleanor turned it over. There was writing on the back. But this time, the handwriting belonged to Walter. Daniel read the sentence. If I ever become too stubborn to say I'm sorry, remind me that being right is a lonely way to live. Daniel almost laughed. The irony was painful. Walter had once understood exactly the kind of man he was capable of becoming. Daniel asked Eleanor one last question. If Walter had opened even one of those letters, would you have gone back? Eleanor answered immediately. Yes. Daniel swallowed. Even years later? Eleanor looked down. For longer than I should admit. Daniel looked at Sarah, then back at Eleanor. An entire life had almost existed. One conversation might have changed everything. Envelope. One answered door. Then Eleanor said something that stopped Daniel from standing. There is something else. Daniel looked at her. Eleanor glanced at the letters. That wasn't the last thing I sent Walter. Daniel froze. What do you mean? There was one more message. Daniel stared. Eleanor's next words changed the story again, and this time, she paused. Daniel stared at Eleanor. For hours, he had been trying to understand why Walter had ignored 47 letters. Now Eleanor was telling him Walter eventually replied. Daniel leaned forward. What did you send him? Eleanor took a moment before answering. It wasn't another attempt to get him back. By then, years had passed. Eleanor had stopped waiting for Walter. Daniel was older. The life she once imagined returning to no longer existed. But Eleanor had spent so many years carrying anger that Walter still occupied part of her life, even while absent from it. So she sent one final message. She told Walter she was done asking for an apology. She told him she forgave him. Not because what he had done was acceptable, but because she did not want to spend the rest of her life letting one terrible night control every year that followed it. At the end, Eleanor asked for only one thing. Before one of us dies, tell Daniel the truth. Several weeks later, Walter replied. The message was short. Eleanor still remembered the first sentence. I don't know how to tell him without losing the man he thinks I am. Daniel looked down. That sentence hurt differently. Walter knew. He knew the version of himself Daniel loved depended on the story he had told. If Walter admitted Eleanor had tried to return, Daniel might see him differently, and Walter could not bear that possibility. Eleanor continued. Walter had also written, "I kept your letters. I haven't earned the right to destroy your words just because I was too afraid to read them." Then came the final line. "Maybe one day he will find them." Daniel immediately thought of the wall, the carefully wrapped bundle, the photograph left in the drawer, the house being left to Daniel. Suddenly, the inheritance did not feel random. Walter had not been able to confess directly, so perhaps the house itself had become his confession. Daniel became angry again. If he wanted me to know, why didn't he just tell me? Eleanor did not defend him. Daniel continued. Walter had died until he was gone. Now I can't ask him anything. Sarah spoke carefully. Maybe he was capable of regret, but not capable of confession. Daniel looked at her. That doesn't fix anything. No, Sarah agreed. It doesn't. Eleanor nodded. Understanding why someone hurt you doesn't erase what they did. Daniel appreciated that Eleanor did not try to make Walter's actions romantic. She did not call his silence love. She did not call his fear protection. She simply accepted that Walter had made a decision, and allowed that decision to grow larger every year. Daniel and Sarah eventually returned to Walter's house. The building felt different now. The dining room was no longer just where Walter had eaten. Daniel imagined him sitting alone at the table after each new letter arrived. The wall was no longer just plaster. It represented every conversation Walter refused to have. Sarah asked if Daniel still planned to sell the house. Daniel looked around. I don't know. He had once believed the house belonged to Walter's story. Now he realized it belonged to all of them. Walter had lived there. Eleanor had left it. Daniel had grown up inside the silence it contained, and Sarah had helped him discover what was buried inside it. Sarah walked back to the opening in the wall. She looked carefully at the old cloth that had wrapped the letters. Then she noticed something. A small stitched pocket. They had missed it before. Sarah reached inside. There was a folded piece of paper. No stamp, no envelope, only Walter's handwriting. Across the top was one word. Daniel. Daniel's heart began pounding. Sarah handed it to him. You want to read it? Daniel stared at Walter's handwriting. I've spent my whole life hearing his version. He unfolded the paper. I think I'm finally ready to hear the part he was afraid to say. Walter's note began simply. If you are reading this, then I probably failed to tell you while I was alive. Daniel paused. He continued. Walter admitted Eleanor had tried to come back. He admitted he received every letter. He admitted he never opened a single one. Walter explained that after Eleanor left the house, he made himself a promise. He would never give someone the chance to leave him twice. Every new letter tempted him. He would hold the envelope, look at Eleanor's handwriting, sometimes stand for minutes, wondering what was inside, but opening one would mean admitting he still cared. So he refused. At first there were only a few letters, then more arrived. Eventually, Walter faced a different problem. The longer he waited, the harder it became to open the first one, because if Eleanor's first letter contained an apology, or an explanation, or a request to return, then Walter would have to confront how many years he had already wasted. So he chose not knowing. And not knowing allowed him to keep believing he was right. Daniel kept reading. Walter explained the wall. At first, he hid the letters because he did not want to see them. Eleanor's handwriting made him question the story he told himself. If the letters disappeared behind plaster, Walter could pretend the choice had already been made. Years later, however, he opened the wall again. That was when Eleanor's letter for Daniel arrived. Walter saw Daniel's name. He knew immediately the envelope did not belong to him. Walter admitted he almost gave it to Daniel. One night, He even carried the envelope upstairs. He stood near Daniel's room. But then Walter imagined what would happen. Daniel would ask who sent it. Then why Eleanor had written. Then whether there were other letters. Walter would have to explain everything. So Walter returned to the dining room. He placed Daniel's letter inside the wall, and sealed it again. Then Walter wrote the sentence Daniel had feared most. I told myself I was protecting you from someone who had left. Daniel's voice became slower. The truth is, eventually I was protecting myself from the possibility that you would forgive her. Daniel stopped reading. Sarah looked away. Walter had finally said it. He had been afraid Daniel might choose Eleanor too. Walter's love had become entangled with fear. He wanted Daniel close, and eventually keeping Daniel close mattered more than giving Daniel the truth. Daniel continued. Walter wrote that as Daniel grew older, he eventually stopped asking about Eleanor. At first, Walter felt relieved. Then he felt guilty. Because Daniel's silence meant Walter's story had worked. Walter wrote, You stopped missing her because I taught you how. Daniel could barely finish the line. For years, he had believed forgetting Eleanor happened naturally. Now Walter was admitting he had helped create that forgetting. Walter continued. He knew no apology could return the years Daniel lost. He could not recreate birthdays, conversations, holidays, ordinary afternoons, all the small moments Daniel and Eleanor might have shared. Walter could only leave behind the house, the letters, and finally, the truth. Then Walter explained why Daniel inherited the house. He had considered selling it, but he could not. Too much of the family story remained inside. He hoped Daniel would eventually repair the dining room. He hoped the wall would be opened. Walter admitted placing the letters openly on the table would have been braver. But even at the end of his life, he could only approach the truth indirectly. Then Daniel reached Walter's final paragraph. I spent most of my life waiting to become the kind of man who could admit he was wrong. Daniel's voice broke slightly. I ran out of time before I became him. Daniel lowered the paper. For a long time, neither he nor Sarah spoke. Daniel expected hatred. Instead, he felt everything at once. Anger, grief, love, disappointment, and something close to relief. For the first time, Walter made sense. That did not make what he did acceptable, but Daniel finally understood it. Sarah eventually asked, What are you going to do with the letters? Daniel looked at the 47 opened envelopes spread across Walter's dining table. They spent enough time inside a wall. The next day, Daniel contacted Eleanor. He asked her to come back to the house. Eleanor hesitated. She had not stepped through that door in decades. Daniel did not pressure her. He simply said, I think we've all spent enough time letting Walter decide who gets to come through that door. Eleanor came. When she arrived, she stood outside for several seconds. Daniel watched from inside. Decades earlier, Walter had refused to open that same door for her. Now it was already open. Eleanor stepped inside. Sarah stood beside Daniel. Nobody made a speech. Nobody knew what words could possibly contain so many lost years. But Eleanor was inside the house again. And this time, silence did not separate them. They sat around Walter's dining table. The letters were spread between them. Eleanor touched the first one. She remembered writing it. She remembered believing Walter might read it the same night. She never imagined Daniel would be the one opening it decades later. Daniel asked Eleanor to tell him something. Tell me what I was like. Eleanor smiled. She told him about the hallway light, how Daniel refused to sleep unless it stayed on. She told him about the foods he hated, the way he laughed when he tried to hide it, how he tapped his fingers when he was nervous. Tiny details, nothing dramatic, but Daniel listened as if they were the most important facts in the world. Because those memories proved something. Even when Eleanor disappeared from Daniel's life, Daniel had never disappeared from Eleanor's memory. At one point, Daniel asked her the question he had been carrying all day. "Do you regret leaving that night?" Eleanor answered, "Yes." Then she looked around the room. "But I left one night." She paused. "Walter spent decades refusing to open the door." Daniel looked toward the damaged wall. Eleanor continued, "Walter regretted not opening the door. We spent decades arguing with one night that had already ended." That was when Daniel finally understood the tragedy. Nothing enormous had destroyed them in the beginning. No single unforgivable betrayal. One argument, one person leaving, one person refusing to listen. Then pride took over. Each unopened letter added another layer. Eventually, the wall Walter built inside the house became the perfect symbol of the wall he had built between them. Daniel decided not to sell the house, at least not yet. He and Sarah repaired the dining room. But Daniel left a small section of the old wall visible, not because he wanted to celebrate Walter's mistake, because he wanted to remember what hiding the truth could do. Eleanor began visiting. Their relationship did not magically become perfect. Too many years had passed. There were awkward conversations, moments when Daniel felt angry, moments when Eleanor felt guilty, questions with no satisfying answer. But there was also laughter, familiar habits, small similarities Daniel had never noticed in himself before. Slowly, Eleanor stopped being the woman from the letters. She became Eleanor. One evening, Daniel, Sarah, and Eleanor sat around the old dining table. Walter's chair remained empty. Daniel placed Walter's confession beside Eleanor's first letter. 47 attempts from Eleanor, one confession from Walter, and decades of silence between them. Daniel realized Walter's greatest gift had not been the house. It had been something Walter himself never learned to use. A choice. Daniel could choose not to repeat the same mistake. He did not have to choose between loving Walter and forgiving Eleanor. He could remember Walter as the man who raised him, and still admit that Walter had hurt him. He could accept Eleanor's mistakes, and still allow her back into his life. Before leaving the table, Daniel gathered all 47 letters. He placed them inside a wooden box. Eleanor watched him. "Why are you keeping them?" Daniel closed the lid. "Because hiding them is what caused all of this." He placed the box on an open shelf. Visible, reachable, nothing behind plaster, nothing buried, nothing waiting in silence. The space inside the wall remained empty. And for the first time in decades, so did the secret. 47 letters had waited years for someone to open them. But in the end, Daniel discovered that the most important thing Walter left behind was not an old house. It was the opportunity to finally open a door that Walter had kept closed for almost an entire lifetime.